So today we're going to be talking about camouflage for SHTF. There are a couple reasons you want camouflage. You either don't want to be seen, or you do want to be seen. But we're going to get into the philosophy behind both of these in just a moment to get set up. And then we're going to keep having this discussion. So we hit on the two big key reasons as to why you would want camouflage for a WROL, SHTF, TOT-walkie type scenario. If you have done your due diligence, and you should have by now, the environment we now find ourselves in is radically different than things were only a few years ago, especially if you're living in places like Ukraine or any other country that's having conflict issues or civil unrest. And if you live in those environments, you really do need to pay attention to what I'm about to say, especially if your nation is at risk of invasion. Sometimes you want to be seen, and sometimes you don't. So when you do want to be seen, you need to project strength. You need to have a little bit of esprit de corps. You need insignia. Now, I will tell you this, the trained observer is the only one who's going to pay attention to your insignia. I can speak on this from a professional capacity, working in both the public and private sector, that people do not look at insignia. They don't pay attention to it. You can be working in a disaster zone thousands of miles away from your area of responsibility, and people will just assume that you're part of the local department or whatever is responsible for that particular area. They will not look into that. The reason you wear insignia is for positive identification by friendly forces and maybe not friendly forces. You need to be very careful how you select your insignia. You don't want to appear too official in your capacity unless you have been empowered by local forces, government forces, and you don't want to misrepresent yourself to them, and you don't want to misrepresent yourself to the general population. As I said though, they're more than likely to not really look at your insignia. It's really that official forces in the area, real government forces, might look at you in a very negative light and might seize your kit or equipment if you're misrepresenting or appear to be misrepresenting what you guys are. I would say that in most scenarios outside of massive civil unrest or situations where civilians are being called up and then given policing powers or given military authority, that you steer clear of anything that looks too official, and you should wait for that type of stuff to be issued to you. Now, moving on to actual camouflage pattern selection, you need to have a couple different options. First and foremost, remember there is no resupply unless you are directly working with government forces, and depending upon how bad things are going, there might not be resupply. Most of your kit in the field might only last 30, 60, or 90 days depending on the type of elemental exposure you're dealing with. And if you're out in the bush and the season begins to change, the pattern that you entered the field with might make you stand out more than even just regular plain civilian clothing. So you need to have a couple different options. Maybe consider caches as an alternative option in the event there is no resupply. It's one of the reasons too why you should likely opt, and I would recommend opting for mostly surplus camouflage patterns, because you'll be able to put a lot more back and it'll be a lot more cost effective. When you start jumping into the ATACs, for example, that you saw at the beginning of the video, even though it works really well in the area that I now reside in, it's not the best pattern for any number of reasons. There's not a lot of aftermarket support for it. You can only buy it through commercial channels, and the most common users of that pattern now are Russian paramilitary forces, and a small number of Ukrainian forces are also utilizing ATACs. So having equipment ahead of time, camouflage ahead of time, and pre-planning for these type of events is going to be very advantageous, as is the training to go along with all of this stuff that you'll be acquiring. Now, as far as picking patterns, and this is a big topic of discussion here, and I want you to comment below what type of patterns are most common in your area based on usage by governmental forces, based on usage by the civilian population at large. Now, your first line kit in this scenario should consist of the most common camouflage patterns in your country, if you can obtain them. I know a lot of this stuff, depending upon where you live, is going to be highly controlled. There are not surplus stores in a lot of countries, unfortunately. But you should try to find patterns that most closely represent or are the identical patterns of ones in use by government forces. You should probably opt for that first based on the scenarios that we are most likely to see over the next couple of years, up to and including foreign invasion, border incursions, and those type of things where you may be required to defend the homeland. It might be advantageous, depending upon where you live in the world, to have patterns like ATACs, ones that are used by forces hostile to your own nation. But be advised, if those camouflage patterns are found in a home search or you are captured wearing those patterns, you likely will be treated very, very badly. So it may be a contingency plan for you, but be advised it may also backfire if that's going to be part of your philosophy or doctrine, but it might be something worth looking into. Now, pattern selection beyond the military stuff, because there is a place for commercial camo. You want to explore ones that are more effective than military patterns, because some of them don't work super well in many environments, and as I hit on early in the video, occasionally you don't want to be seen. This is where various types of low-cost hunting camouflages do come into play, and they do have a place in your preparedness plan. And as I suggested at the beginning, you're not going to have resupply. So having a variety of different options in your loadouts is definitely going to be worthwhile, especially if you have to end up moving from one environment to another. If the event is extreme enough, maybe you're hundreds of miles away or thousands of miles away from where you originally started. Well, the pattern that you wear in your general area is not going to be super effective, let's say in the desert, right? This pattern in the desert wouldn't be as effective as maybe some of the Marine Corps desert camouflage would be, right? So that's just something to keep in mind, that you may have to become highly mobile and that you should have a couple of different options in your loadout. The big thing though that I would try to tell you to steer clear of is, of course, the really expensive hunting camouflage patterns that are out there now. Also because there's just limited support for that in terms of gear and equipment, and having your stuff as unified and uniformed as possible, especially amongst your group, is going to be really advantageous back to the end of things where you're wanting to be seen. And anyone who's conducting hostile surveillance against you or your team, and you're out there trying to project strength when you're pulling compound security or security around an apartment building, whatever it is that you have decided to lock down and secure, you want to project strength. You want to project uniformity. You don't want to look like a ragtag group, because there are a lot of trained observers. There are people who maybe are already participating in criminal activity who are going to look at a ragtag group and not be really afraid of them at all. But if you have a group out there who can project that strength, they're more than likely to just simply pass you by. We've seen how effective armed groups have been during major civil unrest events all around the world and all around the United States over the past 30 years. So that's some food for thought on the methodology of camouflage for SHTF. I've hit on a couple different scenarios, and I'd like to hear from you guys in the comments below. What type of camouflage are you guys looking at? Have you explored this? Are you putting camouflage back for a variety of different reasons? What type of methodology does your mutual assistance group currently have as far as the deployment of camouflage? Is this something you guys have even considered for your SHTF, your WROL, your TOT walkie planning? Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe.